Resume recording. Okay, and I'm going to put this bar over here on the side. So, Unit 5, and I'm going to do. All right, there we go. Everything is running really slow. Obviously, I've got way too many tabs open. And okay, so this is a pretty simple lecture, and it overlaps to a certain degree with the lecture in Unit 6, where I talk about art and its relationship to power, to various types of states, various types of governments and rulers. And it overlaps with the previous lecture on narrative, and but it is a very important topic. The, like fundamentally for the first, um, well, up until the Neolithic, or up until about Göbekli Tepe, we're not really sure how religious versus how mythical versus how just, we don't fully know the meanings of those works of art to be able to say that they're all primarily religious. They appear to us to be, but they're not necessarily. Like the Venus of Willendorf could be an entirely religious object, or a spiritual object, but maybe not, right? It could be an object that they saw as having just basic practical value. But definitely by the time we get to the Neolithic and the end of the Neolithic, and then from there on until until the Renaissance, just the vast majority of art was always religious in some degree. And there was almost no art that you could describe as truly secular anywhere in the world. And it's not until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment where we start to have art that is really separated from religion. Now, it's also true that for most of that time period, it was impossible to separate religion from politics and power. So, because both of those things were so unified and they were so much just a part of society. Okay. And so we're going to have a couple of parts. We're going to talk about art as religious narratives. We're going to talk about art as representing the divine. The order of this is a little bit off, I think, from how I actually go about it. I think my third point might be art as an explanation of theology. And then we have some others, and we end talking about art as a way of creating religious experiences. But I want to make sure right here that we kind of like emphasize the fact that we remember that although a lot of the art that we look at is religious and is Christian religious, right, from either Eastern Orthodox or from the Catholic, and then later in later periods, even art that was more specifically Protestant. In the world, the vast majority of art and the vast majority of religious art is of religions that are not Christianity, right? There's lots of other religions out there, and and most of the world is not Europe, right? Or Europe is not most of the world. Okay, so we're talking about religious art in part because of the Renaissance, because we've been introduced to artists like Giotto and Cimabue and Duccio and these early period at the end of the Gothic, but all through the Renaissance period, we see a lot of religious art. It's interesting because we see so much religious art in the Renaissance, but at the same time, we also see the beginnings of art themes that are semi not religious and then by the time we get to the end of the Renaissance, yeah, we have truly secular themes and motifs in a lot of or some art. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that a lot of the stuff that we've already looked at has been religious, and it maybe doesn't look that religious to us because it's not a reflection of our religious tradition, but to the, well, and also keep in mind that the term religion is a relatively modern term. It's a Enlightenment era term. And so for a lot of these people, the notion of any kind of difference between the religious world, the spiritual world, the everyday practical world, the world of politics and power any idea of them being separate from each other would have been fanciful. They wouldn't have even understood it. And for them, they didn't have a concept of, for a lot of these people, didn't have a concept of religion. They just had a concept of these are the things that we do. These are the things we do, every week. These are the things we do every month. And some of them might be purely practical, and some of them might be, having to do with making offerings to the dead or making sure to stop by at a particular temple to make a prayer and light a candle, right? And that wouldn't necessarily have been seen as religious activity. That would have just as much been seen as practical activity. Okay. But nonetheless, from our definitions of religion, all of this fits into religious art, whether it's familiar to us or whether it's completely unfamiliar to us, whether we're like, have no idea what they're getting at. Like, what did this mean to those ancient Sumerians? We probably will never know, but we can glean some things out of it. So, narrative in religion. I'd already talked about the importance of narrative in like the Greek ceramics and how the narratives that were on Greek ceramics were all primarily mythical narratives, which they occupy kind of an interesting space, a conceptual space, right? Because these are both religious stories, right? They're moral stories. Like this is a story that tells us how a good, strong person is supposed to respond to stress and to trouble. These are these are kind of ethnic stories in that they're stories that say this is what we the Greeks do, right? This is our strength. This is our kind of our character, right? Um, and they're mythological stories, but and they're also sometimes funny and scary, and just fun, like enjoyable stories, but they're also religious stories. They're stories about gods, about the importance of the gods, that run through all of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And whereas by the time we get to Christianity, the narrative is much more embedded in the religion, right? Like here, the religious aspect is kind of like assumed in the story, but it's not necessarily the point of the story. It's a side point of the story. Whereas the passion narrative is the core of the religion of Christianity, right? Um, ooh, is everyone okay? Are you still hearing me? Okay, I just got my internet is unstable message from somewhere beyond. Leanne, can you still hear me?
Yes, you just kind of went silent for a few seconds.
Wonder what's up with that. Okay, so anyway, what I was saying was that in Christianity, there are kind of stories. There are stories that are sort of on the periphery, right? Like Judith beheading Holofernes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's not necessarily the point of that story is not all that religious, but it fits into our religious narratives. But then we also have other narratives in Christianity that are core to theology, right? Like that the theological idea of being saved by the sacrifice of Christ needs the story of the passion, right? Like can't separate those two. Okay. So here we have a different kind of narrative, a different purpose in a way for that religious art. It needs to be telling this story in a way that helps you believe, gives you faith, makes you feel like, you know, yes, this happened for me. Whereas for the religious implications of this story don't really even need to be represented in the image. It's just kind of assumed, right? I mean, and another point of view to think about is that this is a world where, the Christian world was a world where it was kind of assumed that people needed to learn the religious truth in order to be saved. Whereas in the Greek world here, it was the truth of the gods was just assumed, right? And no one worried about like someone not necessarily, well, that's not entirely true, but there was less worry about whether someone was going to be raised correctly religiously. So another point I want to make is that a lot of the things that we look at can be seen to a degree as representations of the divine. And I'm not saying that the Parthenon, when they built it, was like anyone thought like literally, oh, a Doric Greek temple is a picture of the perfection of the divine. But nonetheless, they put so much thought and effort into the system of making these kind of temples, and then the effort to try to outdo each other to get them bigger, more ambitious, more, intensely crafted. Like the craftsmanship on the Parthenon is stunning. Like it's a entirely stone building, right? And it has no mortar to it whatsoever. And the way all the pieces are locked together is that each of the stones would be carved with like little kind of grooves cut into them, like where they would meet on the insides, like little L-shaped kind of grooves. And then when they were placed next to each other, they would pour molten lead to fill in those gaps. And those lead that acted kind of like a staple, right? That holds the two blocks next to each other. It was intensely ingenious system, and that level of craft, that aim for perfection, is definitely like you can definitely make the case that that matches that sort of Greek idea of what the perfection of the divine is about, right? It's mathematical, it's very calculated, it's about the perfect world, right? Like it's very much related to the Platonic ideal. And similarly, although we don't know much about it, but you could make the case that the representation of the Venus of Willendorf, even if the people who themselves were making it didn't think of her as a goddess, right? Maybe they didn't have a word for goddess, right? Maybe they didn't think, but in a way, even if they didn't think of it that way, it's still kind of a representation of their idea of divine, right? Because it's a representation of fertility and of like absolute fertility, right? Okay. So getting back to representations of the divine, we're going to return to talking about the passion narrative, right? And I want you to think about, we're going to look at these, but we're going to look at some more, how in Christianity, there's still a lot of diversity, right? Like this is, I believe, the Ottonian period, right? So pre-Romanesque. It is Ottonian Cologne. And that's a representation of the crucifixion. This is a representation of the passion narrative. This is the scene where Jesus is held before the crowd, who shall I release, right? And they call out for anyone but Jesus. I'm not sure which gospel he's basing this off of, so it might be Barabbas that they're all calling for. But anyway, and it's a beautiful etching. And when we get to etchings, we'll talk more about like the design of this and the way he shaped it and reshaped it. Um, and then here we have three more crucifixions, and each one is getting at a different sort of idea of what the meaning of the passion and of the crucifixion was, right? So like Akins was very much interested in representing what it must have really looked like. He was a historicist, right? He wanted to like he wanted to look at the Gospels and then come up with an image that recreates what it must have really been like in the moment as a real historical event. Rubens is he's trying to create it more like it's a scene in an opera, right? Like you can almost imagine them singing, right? And it's about the drama. It's about you can almost hear the music, right? As they're lowering him down with the light shining so brightly directly on Christ, right? And Beckman's is like it's apocalyptic. It's like like to me, it seems like his starting point was that for the disciples of Christ, Christ being crucified must have felt like the end of the world, right? And after all, when you take the sun being blotted out and curtain of the temple being torn and the earthquakes and even I think I can't remember once again which gospel it is, but in one of them, the dead literally rise out of graves, right? Um, so so Beckman's like, that's like the end times, that's the apocalypse. It must have been terrifying. They must have been overwhelmed and distraught. And so the image is about that, right? They're all efforts. Well, I guess Aikens is probably not really attempting to be religious. I think Aiken's point of view was more more, enlightenment, scientific, more kind of I'm a modern man sort of approach. But for the Rubens and for the Beckman, their purposes were both intensely religious, but quite different from each other. And even Aiken's, although his is maybe the least religious, it's still um, he still wanted to work for religious people, right? He still wanted it to be meaningful on that level, as well as meaningful on the kind of like the real world practicality of like what would it be like to have, to be hanging from a cross with your hands have nails, you know, through them. So here's another point I want to make, which is in a lot of art, and I should have some examples from other traditions, but especially in the Christian tradition, images of saints, of the apostles, of the disciples, and of other saints, images of saints are very important because there are ways for us to kind of tell the story of religiosity from the point of view of someone who goes on that journey, right? Like, because if we only have images of the divine or of the semi-divine, or like of if we only have images of Jesus, right? We don't really get a sense of like someone like us, going, so like wait, do I have Saint Augustine? Um, yeah, this one is St. John and St. Nicholas. I and in the other in the Renaissance lecture, I have St. Augustine. So St. Augustine is a perfect example, right, of a saint who, for a lot of his life, led a very unsaintly life, right? Famously, in some part of his Confessions, he wrote the phrase uh, something like Lord, uh, yeah, something like save me or Lord, make me good, but not yet, right? Like he wanted to be a good Christian, but he wanted to be a sinner for just a little bit longer. Um, and so because of that, right, the images and the kind of narratives that you can make with saints are much more have a lot more use in the way that they can not only show the importance of the divine, but they can show the relationship of piety of the worshiper to the divine, all in one image. And a great example of that is one of my favorite paintings I teach about in this class, which is St. Francis in Ecstasy, right? And in this painting, St. Francis has gone out to the wilderness to basically to find himself, but really to find the divine, right? He's trying to find connection with God. And so he's removed himself. We can see what he has removed himself from. We can see the city that he's removed himself from. We can see the castle. So we're both representing the world of the people and of commerce. We're also representing the world of power, right? And these are both things that he has removed, he has put away. He said, nope, I have nothing to do with. We can see what got him there, right? There's his donkey right there. And here he is living in the wilderness, you know, and all by himself, just praying and just reading the Bible. And then in this image, we have this image of him kind of like having this moment where he really connects and he really kind of feels that connection. We have a very different version of that when we get to the Baroque, and there we have Bernini's The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, where it's much more emotional, right? Almost uh, I'm trying to think of the right word. It's almost sensual, right? Like her experience of the rapture compared to St. Francis's in Bellini's painting, where his rapture is more still and more kind of like maybe more intellectual, right? Interestingly enough, like I talk about this when we'll talk about this painting in another lecture, but in this painting, the divine is represented by the geometric structure of the painting, right? Like the corner to corner diagonal right there, which goes through that arc, almost like an arrow in a bow, right? And goes straight to St. Francis's heart. All right. That is God, right? In the painting. Like there's no picture of God in the painting. God is the geometry, the math behind the painting, right? Which is a very classical way of thinking about divine, but also a very kind of Renaissance way of thinking about the divine, and a very serious intellectual way. And therefore, Bellini's version of St. Francis is also very kind of serious and intellectual, whereas Bernini's St. Teresa is very emotional, it's all passion. Okay, piety. So when we look at images of the saints, we're seeing these kind of journeys of piety, journeys of like faith journeys, right? But other cultures have also represented piety, and I wanted to make this kind of contrast between these two. We have in the Stele of Hammurabi, right? We have Hammurabi, and he's looking to I believe it's Shamash, which is interesting because the patron god of Babylon was Marduk, but Shamash was the sun god, so I guess was seen as more supreme. And here he's praying to the god, and the gesture that he has with his hands is kind of indicating that he's listening, and he's kind of like taking in the words, right? He's like, like tell me what to do, Lord, kind of a approach. And what's interesting is that he is like pretty much eye to eye with his God, right? Because his God is seated on a throne. Shamash is seated on a throne. Therefore, Shamash is much larger, right? Like if Shamash stood up, he would tower over Hammurabi, and the artwork makes that clear. But at the same time, because Hammurabi is standing up and Shamash is seated, they're very close to being eye to eye, which so that kind of both says something about like how important Hammurabi thought of himself, but also is kind of like a message saying to everyone, hey, I see eye to eye with the head God, right? Like me and him were like this close, right? So when I say to do this, that's because that's what the gods say to do. And that's a very different approach to piety than what we see in these much older Sumerian sculptures, where, the hands are clasped and the eyes are upward and they're large. And it's very much about like looking and listening and just waiting for the word, right? Um, it's a much more kind of humbling sort of approach to piety. Speaking of the lack of humble, um, so we have, Michelangelo's kind of version, and I wish I had some other examples I should add to this, because have been a number of notable examples where artists have kind of, and it's not just visual artists, musical artists have made these kind of parallels, and literary artists have made these parallels where, when you are an artist, you are a creator, right? You're making something. And then when you celebrate the divine, when you celebrate God, the primary thing you celebrate the divine for is because the divine is the creator of everything, of all things, right? So, it is not, it has occurred to artists multiple times that there is a kind of parallel relationship between the divine, right? Like here is, you know, God, right? The Father making Adam, right? And making him alive, um, not with breath in this case, but with like a touch. But at the same time, Michelangelo is the one that painted this, right? So he is also in a way in the position of the divine. He is making Adam alive in the painting, right? Okay, like I said before at the start, I just want to take a little brief aside to remind everyone who might be here or everyone will watch this video later that although we've been looking at a lot of Christian art, that is not the only religious art that's out there. There's a lot of other religious traditions, and religious traditions differ greatly. And because they differ greatly, that changes the aesthetics that you apply to the artwork, right? And so we have an example of Shiva as the Lord of the Dance here, and then a Chinese Buddha from the Tang Dynasty, right? And And they are both getting at ideas about the divine and about piety that that are related to ideas that we've seen in Christian art, but are slightly different, right? One thing that we could, would be a good pairing. One thing that would kind of make a connection between Shiva here is if you remember from the art of the ancient civilizations, where we talked about ancient Egypt, and then the cult of Aten, right? If you remember Akhenaten, the one pharaoh who kind of like bucked the system and tried to set up a new sort of religious system where a new god was on top and all the other gods were subservient to that one god, right? And that god was Aten, known as the sun disk. And the sun disk was represented as a circle with all these rays coming down, but then each ray at the end of it had a hand, and each hand did a slightly different gesture. So it was kind of like the idea that, like, from the sun, we get all things, right? It's like not only are we getting sunlight, but we're getting, the growth of the crops, we're getting food, we're getting warmth, we're getting light, right? We're getting, all the things we need to for civilization all come from that, right? And this multiplicity of hands and the rings going around Shiva is kind of reminiscent to that. Okay. And speaking of art of other traditions, it's important to remember that, like, once again, a lot of the art that we look at is Christian. Like, a lot of the buildings that we look at are like, cathedrals, Gothic, um, Renaissance, into Baroque, but there's beautiful architecture all over the world. And so Selimiye Mosque in Turkey is one of the most beautiful buildings in all of the world. It sometimes gets ignored a little bit because of, like Hagia Sophia is in Turkey as well. But this mosque, I think, is just gorgeous. And it's a very it's just a beautiful representation of a different way of thinking about religion, about God, about divinity, and about piety. Okay, so one of my last points is that religiosity and religious experience can be very personal and can be very unique and idiosyncratic. And this is a great example of that. This painting here is by James Ensor. It's called Christ's Entry into Brussels. And so in it, right, this is it. He painted it like close to the end of the century, right? Close to the beginning of the 20th century. And what he was imagining was that in the middle of the parade, like Brussels would have kind of um, a carnival parade, sort of like what they do in New Orleans right now, and about as lecherous and debaucherous as it was in New Orleans, right? They'd have masks on, and everyone would be wearing weird things. So anyway, um, James Ensor imagined that's when the second coming will happen. Christ could appear in the middle here. And of course, because it's funny and kind of ironic, because of course that would be the exact moment where no one would pay any attention to Jesus, because everyone is in costume, everyone is pretending to be someone else, everyone is, completely obsessed with themselves and with having fun. It would have been the last sort of moment where the kind of moment where, like, the second coming would have almost no impact potentially. But there is also this sense of, like, I don't know, there's something almost dark about it, like the judgment is coming, right? Um, so a very personal, very kind of like, one person's sort of weird kind of personal humor and personal piety kind of mixed to make that sort of scene. And so another point I want to make, and like I said before, which was that when we look at art, and that is religious art, we've been talking a lot about what it communicates, like telling religious stories or talking about how it represents the theology, the ideas of the divine, or how it communicates like a path towards piety or a model for this is what good behavior looks like. This is what religious and pious life looks like. But sometimes artwork is religious just purely based off of the experience it creates. Like you walk into many Gothic cathedrals, especially like this is Rouen Cathedral in France, and just walking into the space, it just makes you gasp, right? You're just like, wow. Um, the light, the upward lift of the whole building. And similarly, you know, if you can imagine, being in a monastery in Ireland and your job was to make reproductions of different texts, and someone hands you the Book of Kells and you flip to this page, what what you must have felt was like must have been like awe-inspiring to just see that. So contemporary art. Um, there is, there's less religiosity in art of the 20th century and art of contemporary art, but there is still some. And like the James Ensor piece, a lot of it is much more kind of personal and unique and idiosyncratic. And so, like Joseph Beuys's piece here is very much about like for him, he it's in World War II, he was shot down. He was a fighter pilot. He was shot down, and his plane crashed in Lapland, and he was rescued by Laplanders, right? The Sami, and these people are people who live basically almost like a hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle, something just very close to that, um, up in the north of Finland and Sweden, and and he was saved from dying by these people. And so ever since then, he is kind of like he's seen himself and he's seen the role of the artist as being basically like a shaman for the people, right? And that he, as a shaman, needs to perform certain rites. And that's what he's doing here. This was a piece he did upon entering the United States for his first retrospective in New York City. And what he wanted to do was before he did anything else, he he moved into an apartment in New York City where they'd removed everything out of the apartment, and he lived in this apartment for 3 days, I think. I think it was 3 days. Lived in it for 3 days with a coyote. And they fed the coyote. So hopefully the coyote wasn't too hungry, wouldn't be too interested in eating him. But yes, that's what he did. And it's a strange performance, and it's hard to explain why it's religious, but he thought of it as religious. James Turrell's work, like this piece right here, which are just amazing. They like this piece right there might look like a painting on a wall, right? Because of the photograph. And when you see it from a distance, it really does look like this amazing kind of glowing color painting that almost feels like it's floating on the wall. And it's not until you get up close to it that you realize it's not colors on the wall. It's not a painting on the wall. It is a hole in the wall that you're looking through into another space where all these projected lights are creating this weird glowing color, right? And the experience of these is really quite moving and quite religious like. And James Turrell, he is an ex-Quaker, and in fact he's made some pieces specifically for Quaker meeting houses. Still has a lot of respect for the Quaker tradition, and he's talked a lot about how the experience of his pieces is very much related to his experiences of being a young person growing up in the Quaker church, growing up in meeting houses, which is a very different kind of religion, very different kind of Christianity than what most of us are used to. And then this piece here, Breathing Light, is another James Turrell piece. And I think it's just gorgeous. And I think, yeah, if being in the space, being so, enveloped by light and by color would, for me, definitely feel like a religious experience. So, what do you think? Leanne, you're there? Let me see. Anything in the chat? Was that yes to your, are you there? Yeah, it would be yes. Um, did you hear my question? What do you think about, oh, cooking, can't talk. Okay, I got you. All right. Well, if you don't have any questions, you can type some questions into the chat if you have any. But if you don't have any questions, then the lecture will end there. No questions. Okay. All right. Well, have a good dinner, and I'll see you again in about an hour for the 7 o'clock Zoom. All right. See you then. Bye.